You could see these communities really pop out in space, right? They're very spatially structured. So we know this is an important process in our network, and I'm sure it's in many of your networks as well. So we've got to account for these multiple processes when we're looking at structure. We've also heard about higher order interactions above the dyadic level, right? So there's many possibilities for that, and this is just showing you some triad closure. Something is going on there. These individuals share a partner in common, and then they end up closing that triad. So we may have higher order types of interactions forming or influencing this network structure that we got to think about. And then the confusing thing can be that sometimes these different processes actually can be influencing many different or the same network structure metrics that we're looking at, right? So if we're going back again to closing up our triads here, that could be an effect, a birds of a feather type of effect, right? All those individuals are sharing traits in common that are leading to that third link being added there. But it could also be some other type of friend of a friend effect, right? If we're staying with our bird theme here, we got the Twitter example, the follower of my follower is my friend, okay? Or you could think of other ways this could close through trust mechanisms, more cognitive types of things. Shared time together. Probably a lot of us are closing up our triads this day, right? Because we're sharing time together. Maybe we're finding birds of a feather types of things as well, people that we share things in common with, maybe not. So we've got to think about these in our networks as well, these kind of interacting processes that may lead to the same structure. And how do we account for that? If we go back to the Longtail Manakins example, Dave did a wonderful job talking about this, so I'm not going to go into incredible detail here. And I actually don't know much about mannequins. I've never seen a mannequin in real life. So you'll know as much as I do pretty much by the end of this, hopefully. And we've already seen the video, so I don't have to show them dancing. We could get up here and do the dance ourselves, the butterfly dance and the Toledo calls and whatnot. But we know this is a small tropical bird. You've seen the wonderful pictures of them. They're a lek breeding bird, so they're displaying at these leks. There's not any resources tied to that lek site at all. The females are really shopping around looking for the best lek from their point of view. And these males are cooperatively displaying, doing lots of, or millions of calls and butterfly dances and whatnot, and leapfrog dances here. And that's all done to attract those females to those lek sites. And Dave kind of ruined this by talking about disorderly leks. But for the most part, these are fairly orderly systems. We can have anywhere from 8 to 15 males interacting at these lek sites, interacting in cooperative interactions. And we know that typically there's an alpha and beta male that are doing most of this. But there's also some other males that are there lower down on the hierarchy that are involved in displays and interactions there. And we also know that it has very high reproductive skews. So that alpha male is typically the one that's going to be accumulating all the reproductive success, at least based on our observations of that system. And the rest of the males are really waiting and trying to move up that hierarchy and inherit that high reproductive success of that lek. The reproductive success is really tied to the lek structure, not necessarily to any male over time. And the beta does tend to inherit that same reproductive success in these really hot leks. Excuse me. So going into this process or study, what we're really trying to get out is this question. How do these different multiple processes interact or influence the formation of this complex structure that we see in mannequins that we're seeing in that slide I show you? There's obviously spatial structure in there as well, some other things we could think about that are important. And how does that influence the cooperation, the formation of these cooperation networks? And we took a statistical modeling approach. In this case, I don't want to say this is the best way. Obviously, we have some good reasons we might want to use other approaches for different systems, depending on your data structure, depending on your questions. But for what we're thinking about here, it made a lot of sense for us to use these statistical modeling approaches, such as the ERGMs in this case. And the nice thing about them is they give us a robust way to look at these different multiple processes and how they lead to the global network structure. This is a table from a paper in demography that goes through looking at ERGMs in a human system. And they're discussing some of these differences here. You could obviously go through and look at each of these metrics, right, and correlate that with different processes. And that could be a valid way depending on your system and your data structure. But we often know that these different processes can interact and lead and affect all these different outcomes in the global network structure, right? Triad closure could be influencing degree distribution, mixing patterns, transitivity, those types of things. So with the ERGM method, we can kind of account for this and look at how these different processes together form this structure and see if we can actually build a good manakin network based on what we're putting into this model. So a little bit about the methods. Again, Dave has really already gone over this in detail, and I didn't actually collect any of this data. But this is occurring in Costa Rica at an 80-hectare site that he has there. And he has about 16 years worth of data, them going down every year, observing these manakins from blinds at the different perch zones, somewhere around 10,000 hours of observation. I think you even said more. Maybe I don't have the right number there. And what we did was to construct 2-year networks of those different years that we have, those 16 years. That ended up equating to 8 networks overall. So we did aggregate here into 2-year networks. And if we look at the number of males overall in these networks, we're talking about 139 males over time, over that 16-year period that we're looking at. And what we did was also, we needed to assign them a place in space to look at that spatial structure. So the way we did that was to assign a main perch zone in each of those 2-year networks where they spent the majority of their time. Some males are always at that perch zone. Obviously, some males move around a little bit more to different perch zones. But we had to fix them in space for this type of analysis to look at that. So we just used the place that they were found the most, observed the most. The initial thing we did, and the way that I think a lot of these methods are complementary, is that we initially did use kind of an individual analysis approach so that we can inform our model. We could build a realistic model. We weren't just trying to pull things out of air and put them into this model. So you really need to think about what you need to incorporate in this model. So we initially did look at these kind of individual measures using a null hypothesis random network type of approach, and I'll show you some of those results. Some of the things we looked at were what we call link distance, the spatial distance between individuals that were sharing a link. So we looked at that measure and compared that to null random models. We also looked at clustering coefficient to see how that might differ from random. We looked at some mixing patterns for degree, social status. We thought that maybe could influence the structure. And we also looked at long-term interactions. We know that these manakins have these reoccurring interactions. There's many, many of them. So we felt that that could also be an important factor that we want to look at and see if it's something we should build into the model. A little bit about ERGMs, exponential random graphs. I don't want to say I'm an expert on this. You know, the math, I can understand it when I read it, but you don't want me to explain it to you. It'd be a disaster. There's many good reviews out there where you can go through and walk through them and look at them, see if it's a good fit for what you're doing. And my goal really here is not to walk through all the methods, but just show you an interesting example maybe where we could use this method. And maybe you could see how you could use it in your system. So basically what's going on here, we can think of this a lot like logistic regression. And essentially, if you don't have any dyadic dependence built into your model, it simplifies to a logistic regression. You can just use a basic logistic regression. And what it does basically is model the probability that these social links are going to exist or form based on whatever predictor variables you have in your model. Okay? We can't use, because we're violating, if you have dyadic dependence built into your model, you're going to violate the normal parametric assumptions of logistic regression. So we've got to find another way to fit this model. We can't use the typical methods. And the way that they do that, they fit an approximation of the likelihood via this Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation method. And again, I don't want to explain that. You can go figure that out for yourself by looking at all the papers out there. The nice thing about this is it also gives us a way to look at goodness of fit of our models after we're done building the model and fitting it, because it generates simulated models from the model fit. And you can compare those to your observed networks and see how well your model is actually capturing reality, right? So we'll look at some of that at the end here. Just a little bit about the types of predictor variables. People are often interested in that. There are many, many, many different types of predictor variables you can build in there. And that's obvious, and that's often where people get a little stuck. They're not sure what type of variables they should put in here. Again, I encourage you to kind of look at what's important for your system. Think about what you think could be really critical to forming global network structure from local processes. We can build in individual attributes. You can put in things like age, social status, whatever you can imagine you can build into there as predictor variables. There can be dyadic types of covariates, which I have in my models. Things like spatial distance between two individuals. Relatedness is often something that we're interested in as animal behavior. Other things as well. If you have a directed network, you can do edge covariates. We don't have a directed network in this sense here, so we didn't have those types of covariates. And there's lots of different structural features. There's a slew of structural features you can build into these models. Triad closure is the main one that I'm working on here, but you can look at other types of different ones, stars, cycles, whatever you can think about. But of course, we always want to make sure that the effects we're building into our model are based on the knowledge of our system, right? We should hopefully have some a priori hypotheses. We shouldn't just go on a fishing expedition and throw all these variables in there. First of all, you're probably not going to get these models to converge. You're going to have issues with that type of problem. So you want to think very carefully about this and look through your networks to see what potential things could be of importance in that you want to include in the models. So initially, I'm just going to show you kind of what we got out of our exploratory, I guess, if you want to think about it, types of efforts before we get into the ERGM model. This is showing you spatial proximity, what we call the link distance, really, between two individuals, how far apart were their main perch zones. And this is just a mean of all the networks we looked at here. I didn't want to show you each individual network. And we compare these to our random networks. We're seeing all the networks that we had, all those 2-year networks, 8 of them in total. The distance on average between those is very low in the observed networks. Compared to the random networks, much higher. And that's not surprising. I could have showed you this, and you're like, yeah, I would expect that to occur, right? These males are interacting a lot, and they're close in space. And we don't see very many of these long-distance links, these red links right here, between clusters, spatial clusters. We could look at we could look at triad closure or transitivity here. And again, we're seeing a big difference between our random and observed networks. Observed networks have much higher transitivity than our random networks overall for all of our observed networks. And also, I'm not going to show you the data just for time, but our mixing patterns didn't really show anything of interest compared to the random networks. We didn't see any interesting patterns for degree or social status in those at all for any of our networks. And then the long-term interactions was something we were very interested in. How do these affect the structure of the network? And the way that we initially looked at that was just to compare matrices between 2 time periods. And this is one time period, and these are the individuals at the top here and their interactions between them. And we could build a similar matrix for the next time period, just consisting of those same individuals and not new ones, and look at the distribution of the links in that following 2-year network, which is what you're seeing here. And what we find out is when we compare those, we can use a Mantell test to compare those, see how similar they are, is that they're highly similar. We're seeing a lot of repeated interactions between previous and the following networks. So we know that this is an important component as well. These individuals interact over long time periods, and that helps promote stability in the LEC. OK, so getting to the ERGM part, we've got some idea about maybe some things that could be important to our network. So let's think about building those into the model that we're going to construct here. And so what we did was compare the fit for our full model to some nested models that we have, remove some effects, and see which models were kind of best, if you want to think about it that way, at capturing our data. And we used 7 of the 2-year networks because we couldn't use the first network. We didn't have any knowledge about the previous interaction. So we're just looking at the 7 consecutive networks in this sense. And what we built into our full model, we had 3 effects based on that initial kind of exploratory analysis. We built into some dyadic covariates We knew that link distance seemed to be an important thing. Spatial structure is important in this network. And so to do that, we basically had a distance matrix. That's what we used for that variable, our dyadic covariate. We also knew that long-term interactions were important. These links seem to persist over time. So we wanted to build that into our model, and we just used the previous interaction matrix when we're constructing an ERGM for that specific set of 2 years. And then finally, because we saw that transitivity was fairly high here, we wanted to build in a structural triad feature. It didn't seem that homophily was important, but some sort of triadic closure type of effect was probably going to be needed to model this system. And we use this geometrically weighted edgewise shared partner distribution. I think someone mentioned this yesterday. This is just an edge kind of approach to thinking about triad closure. It's measured on edges, not on nodes. But this kind of funny little figure shows you that here. If we have two individuals, J and I, they're linked. And then we look at if they share basically a link to another similar partner, the same partner, which is what you're seeing here. This means that they share one link. If they then have an additional individual they are hooked up to, that's another link. They're at 2. If they then have another one, they're at 3, and so on and so forth. The thing about this term, it looks at the probability of this, but it also has a declining effect. So you wouldn't expect them to keep adding a shared partner over time. It would decline. The probability of this would decline as you increase the number of shared partners, right? And the nice thing about this effect is that it's very stable. It helps these models converge compared to some of the other triadic closure effects you can try to build into it. So it seems to be a very robust way to look at triad closure in these systems. And so we ran ERGM models and the selection process for every network we looked at, all 7 of them. And I'm just going to kind of give you the overall summary of this. We're not going to go through each of the 7 networks. And first, just looking at the coefficients. And what I really want you to get out of here is that they're very similar in their patterns, the coefficients that we're getting out of this, the log odds coefficients. Well, first of all, what we found is that the full model is our best fit. When we're comparing those to nested models, the full model is really the best fit for all these networks, so including all 3 of those effects. And they're very consistent in their direction of effect. So these things are having a positive impact on link formations in these networks. And then spatial distance is having a negative impact. You're going to be less likely to form a link if you're farther apart, right? And so it's nice to see that we're seeing consistent patterns across all these networks, nothing different. If we want to think about that, how that impacts the probability of forming links between individuals, again, this is summarized averages for all 7 of those ERGMs across those 14 years we were looking at. We could first look at link distance. And what we're seeing is that close individuals are more likely to form links over time. If we average that out across all our 7 models here, it's something like 2.6 times more likely they're going to form a link if they share a purge zone in common than if they were 200 meters apart. So it is having an effect here on network formation, at least that spatial structure. Persistence is important. Once you're a friend, you could think about you're probably going to be a friend again, right, if you want to think about it in that perspective. So if you have a link already here, over time, you're likely to maintain that link. In this case, it was 4.2 times more likely on average to maintain a link or form a link if you had a previous one. You cooperated previously. And then that triad closure effect, that kind of friend of a friend effect here was also important. They're closing up these triads. And on average, we're looking at about 2.2 times more likely to cooperate if they had a friend of a friend in common. Of course, we want to look at our model. We want to see how well does this capture reality. You know, did we do a good job? Is it a good fit? We're seeing these effects. And what we can do is look at some different network metrics and compare them to our observed between our observed and our simulated networks. And that's what's shown here, just some different ones that you can get out of the ERGM package. I didn't mention, but I did use StatNet for this in R to construct these ERGM networks. And so what you're seeing here are the 95% confidence intervals, basically in the gray, and then the observed networks are in the black line. This is just for one of them. I have these for all of them, and they look very similar. So I just showed you the first time series here, 1983 or 1985 and 1986. And you can see if we look at the the distribution of the edgewise shared partners, it's very nicely matching between the simulated from the model and the observed networks. If we look at geodesic distance, shortest path, it's doing a fair job of capturing it. There's maybe one that's starting to pop out a little bit there, but it's still in the realm of what we would expect based on that model. And then we could look at degree distribution. Again, we're within our 95% limits there. It seems to be matching up with reality, so that's good. We like that. Of course, I like to look kind of at the qualitative sense of these networks, look at them visually and see, OK, is that something that looks like a manakin network to me? And what I have here is just one simulated network from a fitted model, and then our actual observed network that was built, but that's the observed network that the model is based on. The colors here represent just the perch zones. So yellow is one perch zone, and blue is another, and so on and so forth. The red links right here are the long-term interactions in the network. And when we compare a simulated network to our observed one, they look quite a bit similar. They look like a manakin network to me. We've got some clustering, in space, maybe some spatial structure here. These guys are all linked up. We like to see that. We can see this perch zone is all linked up. We like to see that as well. So we're capturing that. And if we look at just some basic measures out of there, yep, our transitivity is right on. The proportion of long-term links in both networks is very close. Our link distance is very close. So we seem to be capturing some of the reality here. Obviously, we know that all these models are wrong. There's other processes probably that are important here that we're not capturing. But hopefully, we've been able to capture some of them and build a realistic model that we can use. So just in kind of conclusion, hopefully I've shown that it seems like cooperation in these manakins is influenced by a number of different processes in concert. Spatial structure is very important, as we saw. And that, again, ties into this idea of cooperation in spatially structured networks. We typically wouldn't expect to see a lot of cooperation in well-mixed networks, right? And so that seems to be holding true for this network, that it's not well-mixed. The stability of the long-term interactions, well, we know those are critical for the reproductive success of these leks. You want to have orderly leks. If they get disorderly, the females don't show up. They're not going to be interested in mating with those males. So maintaining that stability, maintaining those long-term interactions so you can increase your rank in the hierarchy and hopefully make it to the alpha status if you live long enough. And then this triadic closure term right there. What's actually going on there with that biologically? Well, you could think of all sorts of different mechanisms for that. It's not a homophily one, at least. But maybe it's shared time together, right? These males are spending time together at the same lek site. So eventually, they're going to close up those triads, right? Maybe you could come up with something more complicated based on trust. I don't know if that's a good idea for this system, but it might be for yours, depending on what you're looking at. And then just kind of a conclusion about the method in general. I think we can, depending on the system, obviously, you got to look at your data structure and the types of questions you want to ask. But it seems like we can use these methods for animal social networks to kind of look at these bottom-up developments, right? The micro to macro type of development, going from local processes and scaling up to global network structure. How do those interrelate? So at least for our system, it seemed like it worked out well. And of course, whenever you're looking at the specification of the model, the parameters in your model is really key. First of all, you don't want to go on a fishing expedition and just throw all these parameters in there. And you're probably not going to get a good model fit. Your models probably won't even converge. So you really have to think about what you're going to build into these models, right? And hopefully, you can develop some a priori hypotheses based on your knowledge of the system or different exploratory analyses. So you can create a decent model to begin with that then you can go through and test and see if you can reduce it in complexity. And of course, keep it simple, right? You don't want to have 15 effects in these models. It's just not going to work out. So you got to focus on the main ones that you think are important in your system, okay? And then just in conclusion, I'd like to thank our Wyoming network group, as well as my funding sources there. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. And that's all I have.